Hi, everyone. This is the second cardiovascular lecture. We'll talk a bit about blood vessels today. And then on Monday, we'll talk about blood. So let me go ahead and get things going here. All right, so when we talk about blood vessels, remember blood vessels are those tubes that move blood to and from the heart in a variety of different ways, and also exchange. So let's talk a bit about the major types of blood vessels. We have arteries, which are responsible for primarily carrying blood away from the heart. Arterioles, which continue to do so, but they're smaller. We have capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels. This is where gas, nutrient, and waste exchange occurs. We have venules, which move blood back to the heart by way of the capillaries, very small. Venules are to the veins what arterioles are to the arteries. And then finally, we have veins that move blood ultimately back to the heart and receive blood from the venules. Okay, so let's talk about blood vessels. There's basically three, when we talk about blood vessels, if we were to slice through a blood vessel, depending on the nature of the blood vessel, there's three main layers histologically. We have the innermost layer, which is known as the tunica intima or the tunica interna. Tunic means layer. What do we find in that internal layer? A simple layer of simple squamous epithelium we call the endothelium. The middle layer is known as the tunica media. Tunica media is made up of smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle is essential for regulating the size of the vessel. When the smooth muscle contracts, this causes a vasoconstriction, essentially reducing blood flow. When that smooth muscle relaxes, there's what we call a vasodilation, which allows for an increase in blood flow. Tunica externa is the outermost layer made up of connective tissue. So we have the intima, media, and externa. And of course, underneath all of that, just adjacent to the intima is the lumen, which is the central blood-filled space where blood flows. All right, so this is interesting. This is kind of this is a actual photomicrograph of an artery and a vein. And of course, we'll take a look at these layers individually, but one thing you can see clearly is interesting is that the artery is nice, wide open. Here's the central blood-filled cavity, nice round. The vein is in a collapsed state. And one of the reasons for this, and we'll see shortly, is that it has a very small, smooth muscle layer. So we don't have that musculature that, as well as elastic fibers that we'll see shortly, that keeps the blood vessel open. All right, so here is kind of a classic difference between an artery and a vein. Here we have the tunica intima, which is this simple squamous epithelium. Now, if you take a look carefully, one of the things you'll notice that in the case of an artery, in addition to that endothelium, we also have an elastic membrane. We have both an internal and an external elastic membrane. The internal one is just outside the endothelium. We have the tunica media, which we have in both. And one of the things you should be able to see is that with the tunica media in the artery, it's relatively thick relative to the vein. And we have, of course, a lot of elastic fibers. So the tunica intima, both vein and artery, have simple squamous epithelium. The difference underneath that is we have the tunica media, which is thick, as opposed to the thinner tunica media in the vein. The tunica media also has an internal and external elastic membrane, which provides the elasticity that the arteries need. Finally, we have the tunica externa, which is made up of collagen fibers, which surround the vessel. And here is our capillary, which is just the endothelial cells. So let's take a look at that more in depth. So you've got the idea that we have three layers in arteries, 3 layers in veins. Let's take a look first at the elastic arteries. The elastic arteries are the largest of all the arteries, sometimes called the conducting arteries. Good example of where we would have an elastic artery would be the aorta. And you could say the pulmonary artery as well. They have a lot of elastic fibers, which helps to withstand the surge in blood pressure that comes from the heart. All right, so this is a typical example of an elastic artery, such as the aorta, where we have the tunica interna or tunica intima. Either are correct. We've seen both in the literature. Here's the lumen where the blood's flowing. Here is the tunica media, where in addition to having the internal and external and internal elastic membrane, we also have a lot of elastin within the muscle itself. So a lot of elastic fibers permeate through the arteries. Here's the tunica externa. A little bit smaller than the arteries, than the elastic arteries itself, is what we call the tunica media. And the tunica media, although it just still has the smooth muscle, it has fewer elastic fibers within the muscle itself, but we still do have the internal and external elastic membrane. So if you take a look here we've got the lumen, here we've got the tunica interna, here we've got the internal elastic membrane and the external elastic membrane, but not nearly the abundance of elastic fibers like we saw with the elastic artery. So let's take a look. This is a typical elastic artery with a lot of smooth muscle, but also a lot of elastic fibers throughout, as well as the external and internal elastic membrane. Whereas with the muscular artery, we don't have as many elastic fibers. Let me take a look here for 1 second. Okay, let me go back, hold on. We have fewer elastic fibers throughout, much more muscle, but we do have this internal and external elastic membrane. The tunica intima you can barely see. And most arteries of the body are like this, outside the aorta and the pulmonary artery. The smaller tributary arteries are typically muscular. Let's take a look at the arterioles now. So going from the elastic arteries to the muscular arteries, which are most of the arteries, to the arterioles, instead of having 3 layers, we now have 2. We only have a tunica intima and a tunica media. The absence of a tunica externa allows the tunica media to be much more prominent, and it basically helps to regulate the flow of blood through the body mostly. So the musculature of the tunica media can undergo a very dramatic vasodilation, vasoconstriction, dilation, constriction. And this is basically controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So the blood flow, regulation of blood pressure, a lot of the diameter of the blood vascular system occurs in the arterioles, and this is primarily under the control of the sympathetic nervous system, regulating the dilation and constriction of the muscle. The elastic fibers Of course, we find with the large arteries, with the expansion, constriction, as well as lesser extent with the muscular arteries. But by the time we get to the arterioles, there's no elastic fibers. It's basically just muscle in the tunica media. And this is a diagram showing a arteriole. Here is the tunica intima. Here we have the tunica media with the smooth muscle. No tunica externa at all. And again, these are smaller than the arteries themselves. What about the capillaries? So the capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. They're so small that the diameter allows for a single red blood cell to move through in single file. What are the functions of capillaries? Well, basically capillaries allow oxygen to enter in blood, as well as allowing for carbon dioxide to leave. This occurs at the capillaries of the lungs. So oxygen uptake and the expiration or the elimination of CO2. The function of the capillaries is in the small intestine is to receive digested nutrients that have been digested and they're absorbed into the blood. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the capillaries, and the kidneys use those capillaries to remove nitrogenous waste, this whole idea of filtration. So when we talk about capillaries, they're all have a single layer of endothelium. That's common. But there are certain differences between the connection between those endothelial cells. The most common type of capillary is what we call continuous capillaries. There's a few gaps between those, the endothelial cells that allow for small molecules to go into and out of the capillaries. So if we take a look, this is an example of a continuous capillary. The most common, we do have, again, a little bit of space, a little bit of what we call intracellular clefts. But for the most part, the capillaries are bound, or the capillaries consist of these endothelial cells that are bound by tight junctions. So most areas of the body have these continuous capillaries. There's one exception where that continuous capillary is taken to the extreme, and those of you in physiology, my physiology class will recognize this. These are the continuous capillaries that are found associated with the blood-brain barrier. There are no spaces at all. As you can see right here, these are spaces. With the typical continuous capillary, even though they have tight junctions, there's few spaces which allow for small molecules to go through. There's no spaces in the blood-brain barrier, complete tight junctions. So what you saw here with tight junctions, it's across the board with the blood-brain barrier. Oops. Obviously, certain molecules have to get through. Things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients can get across through special transport barriers, through transport mechanisms. Oxygen and CO2 get through very easily, which they do with all cells. But the difference here is that allowing other molecules through, such as glucose, for example, requires a selective transport, right? With other types of continuous capillaries and other types of cells, they get through with just simple facilitated diffusion. Certain molecules can get through, such as certain anesthetics, certain molecules, such as certain drugs, for example, fat-soluble drugs. Then we move to the next level, which are known as fenestrated capillaries. And fenestrated capillaries have what are called fenestrations. They have a lot, which are pores. We find this in areas of the body where there's a high rate of exchange. So we're going from blood-brain barrier type capillaries, which are completely continuous, really only oxygen and CO2 get through with some few drugs, but nutrients require selective transport. Then we have just straight continuous capillaries, which are most cells of most tissues of the body, where we do have oxygen, CO2, nutrients get through, but no large molecules get through. In the case of fenestrated capillaries, we actually have large molecules that go through because we have pores. So there's more openings, fewer openings with continuous, virtually no openings with blood-brain barrier. And this allows for secretion of hormones, filtration in kidneys, as well as the small intestine. This is a good example of a fenestrated capillary, where you can see all this tremendous amount of pores, kind of like Swiss cheese. Finally, we have the most permeable capillary, which are the sinusoids, sometimes called discontinuous capillaries or leaky capillaries. These are fenestrated, but also have a large number of wide intracellular clefts. These occur in hemopoietic organs, organs that are forming blood cells, such as the bone marrow and the spleen, which allows the blood cells to actually go from the capillary out. Normally, the spaces, the fenestrations or the openings are too small to allow for blood cells. So much more permeate here. And you can see all these wide spaces. So going from largest space to space, largest spaces are the discontinuous capillaries or the sinusoids. These occur in hemopoietic organs. We have the fenestrated capillaries, which are a little bit smaller, but still large enough to allow certain proteins and things like that to filter through the kidneys, absorbed through the small intestine, as well as be secreted through the endocrine system. And then we go down to continuous capillaries, which are even smaller, very little space, which allow some small molecules, and of course, all allow oxygen and CO2, all these capillaries. We have some tight junctions, which prevent movement of material across, but there are still some clefts. And then finally, the subtype of continuous capillaries, which are found associated with the blood-brain barrier. Those basically do not tolerate movement of really anything other than oxygen, CO2, glucose, things like that, have a special transport mechanism that allows them to get across, but there really are no intracellular clefts. Let's take a look at the vessels so we've gone from arteries to arterioles to capillaries. Let's look at returning blood back to the heart. One of the interesting things, of course, is when we talk about blood pressure, which we do in physiology a lot. Blood pressure is highest in the arterioles, or the arteries, gets smaller in the arterioles, very little in the capillaries, virtually no blood pressure there, very low in the venules. So there's this hierarchy from highest in the arteries, less in the arterioles, less in the capillaries, very low in the veins. Okay, very low in the veins. So what does this really mean? Well, basically means that in order for blood to flow from one compartment to the next, you need to have a pressure gradient. So by the time blood reaches the veins, there's very little blood pressure. There's no drive to get it across, to get it back to the heart. So we need to have special strategies. So we'll take a look at those shortly. All right. Let's take a look at, first of all, the anatomy or the histology of a vein. First of all, in case of a vein, there's structural difference. We still have the 3 layers, much like we had with the artery, but we have less or very little elastin. There is less muscle. Most of the blood in the body at any given time is in the veins. It's kind of a reservoir. But like I said, there's less muscle, less elastin. The walls are thinner, so there's not the constriction, dilation that's going to drive blood through. Okay, let's take a look at kind of a little summary here at the relative makeup of blood vessels, and we'll talk about how blood gets back to the heart. It's very easy for it to go from the heart through the arteries. The arteries have that elastin muscle. They help to push it through. Arterioles, same thing with the musculature. Exchange occurs at the capillaries. Now we're at the veins, right? Well, just to kind of pause for a second, let's take a look at the kind of relative makeup here of these arteries and veins. The arteries, you can see, have a lot of, there's smooth muscle, some elastic tissue, right? Very little connective tissue. But the main thing I want to focus on is we have a fair abundance of elastic tissue and smooth muscle in both types of arteries, even though there's less elastin in the muscular artery, but there's still elastin. That's going to provide a driving force and a lot of muscle. By the time we get to the arteriole, there's virtually no elastic fibers. It's basically tunica intima and tunica media. Whatever connective tissue is there, it's within that. There's no outer layer. There's only intima, media, whereas the other two, intima, media, and externa. Let's take a look at the capillary. We only have the tunica interna. What about the veins? The veins, we only have a tunica interna and a tunica externa. Whatever muscle there is, it's very little. It doesn't make up a layer. So, summary. Arteries have 3 layers, intima, media, and externa. Arterioles have 2, tunica interna, tunica media. Capillaries have 1, tunica intima or interna. Venules have 2, tunica interna and tunica externa. That muscle does not make a media. And then finally, we're back to the vein where you have all 3. But you notice the key thing is here is very little muscle compared to what we saw with the arteries, right? Very little muscle and virtually no elastin. This creates a problem in terms of how to move blood back to the heart, right? So especially in the legs, right? This is a problem, going against gravity and very low blood pressure. Fortunately, we have 3 good strategies that move blood back to the heart. We have valves, which are one-way valves that when the blood moves through, the valves going back to the heart open up in the veins and they close. They don't open up the other way. We have what's known as the respiratory pump, which we'll talk about, and the skeletal muscle pump. All right. This is the skeletal muscle pump. It's just the muscle, but it acts as a pump. Think of like milking the udders. Basically, when you squeeze, the muscle contracts. This is skeletal muscle, for example, in your legs. When the muscle squeezes, it pushes blood, right? Now, it pushes it up and pushes it down, but because these venous valves, which are one-way valves, just like the valves in the heart, don't open down. So blood does not flow down. Instead, it flows up as this valve opens one way, helping to push blood back to the heart. All right. Now back up for a sec. We do have a respiratory pump, which is basically the role of breathing, where when you breathe, this lowers the pressure. Inhale, when you inhale, lowers the pressure inside the thoracic cavity. And when the pressure is lower in the thoracic cavity, it draws the blood up. So we have veins, respiratory pump, skeletal muscle pump. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about kind of a throwback. I mentioned that the circulation of our body, it consists of both a pulmonary circuit and a respiratory circuit. Pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. Pardon me, I'm just off today. This pulmonary circuit consists of blood vessels that are going to and from the heart, between the heart and the lungs, blood flowing between the heart and the lungs. And the systemic circuit is between the heart and all the other organs of the body. All right. So let's take a look at the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit, blood leaves the right ventricle. So remember, this oxygen poor blood came back to the right side of the heart through the atria. Remember the right atria, which brought back through the vena cava to the right atria, to the right ventricle, which is oxygen poor, pumps this out into the pulmonary arteries. Okay, the pulmonary, then of course from the pulmonary arteries, blood goes to the lungs, dumps off CO2, picks up oxygen. Oxygen then comes back through the pulmonary veins, back to the left atria. What else can we see at the pulmonary circuit? Because blood does not have to flow as far, it's only going between the lungs and the heart. The walls are thinner of the vessels, and the arterial pressure that's in the body is lower in the pulmonary circuit than it is in the systemic circuit. Systemic circuit consists of the veins are the superior vena cava that carry oxygen poor blood into the right atrium. And then we have the systemic arteries, namely the aorta and all of its branches, carrying blood away from the heart to all the different organs in the body. So oxygenated, deoxygenated. And notice here, for example, the arteries in the pulmonary circuit carry oxygen poor blood. The veins carry oxygen rich blood. With the systemic circuit, it's the opposite. All right. What are the major arteries of the systemic circuit? And we'll do this also when we get to that point in the lab after the next lab exam. All the arteries in the systemic circuit are branches of the aorta. Okay. If you take a look at this picture, of course, you can see the aorta. It goes up, which is what we call the ascending aorta, hooks over, that's the arch, and then goes down, that's the descending aorta. Okay. The aortic arch branches into three main subdivisions, what we call the brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, and the left subclavian. So if we go back here, I know it's kind of small. Here's the ascending aorta. Here's the arch. There's three branches that come off, right, before it actually descends again. Those three branches are the brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, left subclavian. The descending aorta is divided up into two. I mean, it's really one structure, but we give it two names depending on where it is. The descending aorta that's still in the thoracic cavity is called the thoracic aorta. The descending aorta that's in the abdominal cavity is called the abdominal aorta. The aorta ends at the iliac arteries. So if you take a look, here's the ascending arch with the three branches, descending, which this would be the thoracic aorta, this would be the abdominal aorta. It ends where we have what's called the common iliac artery. When you think of iliac, think of ilium. All right. So this is kind of a nice little summary which shows, let's see, here we go. This is a kind of a summary picture showing that the vessels that go into and out of the heart, kind of the complete picture. Just to summarize, here we've got the heart, here we've got the ascending aorta, aortic branch, aortic arch, descending aorta. Remember, the ascending aorta has branches that form the coronary arteries. If you take a look right here. The aortic arch has branches that include the brachiocephalic trunk, the left subclavian, and the left common carotid. So if you go back here, brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. Brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. We're not going to get into all the other details as well, but then you can take a look and see the blood that goes through these vessels, then returns back to the heart through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Blood then comes back into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, gets pumped out through the pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary arteries. Remember, blue, deoxygenated, goes to the lungs. Dumps off CO2, picks up oxygen, returns back to the heart by way of the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins are actually going to come back to the heart right through here. Doesn't really show them very well. But you can remember from back here, sorry about this, this would be the pulmonary veins coming back to the left atrium. So that is it for the second lecture. So that's the cardiovascular 1, cardiovascular 2. Again, I'm going to have office hours today at 12:30 to 1:30, and then from 3:30 to 4:30. If you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me. I will be sending out a study guide sometime this weekend because on Monday we'll be going over the third cardiovascular lecture and then having a review. Okay. So let me go ahead and sign out. Oops. Meetings. Oops.